Economic growth or economic development fundamentally is linked to competition. I don't think there's any controversy about that. And competition requires as a prerequisite that the players or participants in competition firms have the ability to freely enter and exit from the competitive process or from markets. And in some sense, we had a dramatic reform in 1991, which essentially, I think the highest point perhaps was industrial delicensing, which was basically allowing free entry. But we never quite completed the agenda of free exit. And I believe that 2016, the commencement of this new code, in some ways is that dramatic step of actually enabling free exit of enterprises. How successful, how good we have been at, we have done that is of course a matter of discussion. So that's the importance of the connection between IBC and economy or economic growth. And I also believe that what IBC does, the code does, is manifested not so much in the actual empirical data that you will have. And Dr. Sahu's group, his team puts out information quite comprehensive and detailed all the time. But I submit to you that the real impact is not what is seen in terms of data or outcomes. It's actually the unseen in terms of the impact or changes it brings on behavior of firms, behavior of participants, especially when it comes to credit discipline, especially when it comes to exerting yourself to avoid falling into bankruptcy, especially about creditors and debtors interaction and the bargaining process. So I think that of course is the big topic. And the last point I want to mention is that one of the manifestations also, although Dr. Debroy was, I think, sounded a little bit skeptical about it, but definitely one of the manifestation of the impact is the way we are seeing improvement in the ease of doing business. Whether you capture it in terms of a ranking in the global rankings, or whether you capture it in terms of various metrics, but certainly apart from credit discipline, apart from increasing the value of the salvaged or restructuring, certainly I think one of the manifestations in the economy is in terms of the ease of doing business, whichever way you measure it, whichever way you describe it. So I now would like to welcome Dr. Prachi Mishra to make a presentation. She'll go first.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Good morning, everyone. My name is Prachi Mishra. I work for Goldman in the Global Macro Research Group. Thank you very much to Devanshu and to Vidhi for having me here. It's a real pleasure. And thank you, Ajit. I think it's yet again we are sharing the dais. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. What I'm going to do in the next 10 to 15 minutes is talk about the Indian economy, where I see it now and where I see it going forward. I don't have much time, so I'm going to focus on the growth outlook, and I'm happy to contribute in the discussion on other aspects. So my outlook for 2020 and 2021 for the Indian economy is titled "A Rising Tide Following a Painful Transition." And as I go along, I'll explain why this title. But I think I'm not a legal expert. I don't know anything about legal issues, so I won't be able to refer to that. And probably the panel can discuss what the implications of the economy are for IBC and the legal aspects. Of course, IBC forms one part of some of the big reforms which India has done. So I am going to refer to that as I go along. So this, if you look at this picture, 2019 has been a very difficult year for India. The Indian economy slowed significantly and sharply. So this is basically a Goldman India Current Activity Indicator. It's basically a combination of about 15 high frequency indicators and they're combined using a globally consistent methodology. This is showing about a slowdown of about more than 2 2 percentage points relative to the early 2018 phase. The slowdown is more than expected. This is what you see. This is for FY20. The audience here knows, India operates in its fiscal years, which run from April to March. The slowdown is also, is much higher relative to our own expectations as well as consensus expectations. So everyone was surprised to the downside given how numbers are evolving. Of course, the next question you'll ask is, what lies behind the slowdown? Market perception on the slowdown, particularly financial market perception on the slowdown, is twofold. One, that it's all domestic. It's, global factors have no role. And number two, it's all NBFC, which is, shadow banks, the crisis which started with a default of ILFS last year, September. That's what the Indian slowdown is. Our research comes up with a different view, and this picture, is sort of a testament to that view. This plots our global current activity indicator, which is combining all the countries around the globe, and the light blue line is the India current activity indicator. So if you look at the timing of the slowdown, Indian economic slowdown, in our view, it started in January 2018, exactly the same time when the global slowdown started. So just this evidence, before I go into empirical research, etc., just to say that, global factors did not play any role, makes just by looking at this picture makes less sense. When we, of course, do the empirical analysis, about 40% of the slowdown in India current activity indicator can be attributed to a slowdown in India's trading partners growth. So number one, in my view, global factors did play an important role. Of course, it was not only global factors, but domestic factors mattered as well. And of course, NBFC problems and funding constraints were important. However, again, referring to the timing of the slowdown, if the slowdown started in January 2018, the date of the slowdown predates the NBFC crisis, which started in September 2018. So again, looking at the timing and referring to the timing, the NBFCs cannot be the sole issue. And in my view, the slowdown predates the NBFC crisis. Of course, the NBFC crisis aggravated the slowdown and made the funding constraints even more severe. However, that's not the sole factor. Again, our empirical analysis suggests that even among domestic factors, there are other domestic factors as well, which include a sharp decline in consumer confidence. About 30% of the slowdown in our India current activity indicator can be attributed to a slowdown to a decline in consumer confidence, a negative central government fiscal impulse during this period, and in addition to that, funding constraints, which are the common market view, is also important. And let me also say that, though, we are talking about this slowdown episode, I think this Indian slowdown is a longer term phenomenon which has been going on for a while. And this picture shows, if you look at heydays of India's GDP growth, there's a lot of debate on GDP, what series, etc. This picture shows the new GDP series. If you compare, GDP growth rate during 2004 to 2011, and now, no question, I think the slowdown started around 2011-12, and almost entirely, if you look at the light blue bar, almost entirely driven by investment. Of course, exports slowed down, which is the green bar, but imports slowed down as well. So net exports is actually the slight gray bar, is actually not that much of a drag on GDP growth, again, as is commonly perceived. The dark blue bar, which is consumption, was holding economic growth so far. And that has begun to slow down. If you look at the panel on the right, this is only a consumption index, unlike the current activity indicator, which is a comprehensive indicator of the economy. This is only a consumption index, and that has begun to slow down as well. How do I see things going forward in 2020 and 2021? I mean, my bottom line of my view is that 2020 and 2021 should be better than 2019. And why do I say so? There are 5 reasons and 4 key drivers, which are the little bars which you see in this picture. So let me start with the first one. I think our view on the global economy is that 2020 should be better for the global economy than 2019 for 2 reasons. One, the US-China trade war should be less of a drag on global growth in 2020 and 2021. And second, financial conditions, global financial conditions have tightened a lot in 2019. And that has begun to reverse globally, which you can see here. And that should be supportive of global growth. So the global economy should look better in 2020, and that would imply that in India's trading partner growth should look better, and that would have positive spillovers for India's growth as well, number one. Number 2, this is domestic financial conditions in India. This is a very simple average of short-term interest rates, long-term interest rates, equity prices, and trade-weighted exchange rate. That has eased by about 100 basis points since early this year. Of course, RBI has reduced rates. Other rates along the curve have also eased. So the second reason why we think 2020 and 2021 should be better is, supported by easing domestic financial conditions, measured by standard measures of financial conditions in the economy. Third, we do expect fiscal impulse to be positive this year. No matter how we measure it or what the headline numbers suggest, government has increased spending significantly over the last few months. And you can see that particularly on the right panel where, off-budget entities like National Highway Authorities of India have increased the pace of awarding contracts and construction activity. Fourth, I think argument is a more subtle argument, which is, next year and the year after. I mean, both the central bank and the government have taken a series of measures to address the slowdown. And some of the, less advertised measures among them, I think, are 2. One is, debottlenecking the GST refunds, which were actually, a significant bottleneck to growth. Speeding up those refunds, new refunds within 60 days and any pending refunds in 30 days, that should be, a positive on growth. And second, there were a lot of delays and non-payments by the government to a number of SMEs, and those also have been sped up. So just this picture and the next is just to give you an idea of the number of measures which have been taken. As an analyst, I think, basically what I'm building in my forecast is some impact on sentiment, which you've already seen. Equity markets have rallied by about 10%, 15% since early September, and some easing of supply bottlenecks. For example, if you look at labor, labor code, which allows fixed-term employment contracts, is a fairly big reform which is currently in Parliament. And of course, needless to say, a new corporate tax order where, India's corporate taxes have moved from among the highest, which you can see before the reform, to among the lowest across the globe. All of this, as an analyst, I have to build that in my forecast in terms of both sentiment effect and direct supply bottleneck effects. So 4 reasons why I think 2020 and 2021 should be better. Number 1, our forecasts are that global economy should be better. Number 2, domestic financial conditions have eased. Number 3, there is fiscal impulse and will be more going forward. And fourth, there have been a series of measures which should feed into both sentiment as well as easing of supply bottlenecks. Are we seeing any green shoots? I think we are seeing some very early signs of economic stabilization. It's hard to pinpoint turning points in any country's economic cycle, or to precisely pin down the magnitude, but we are seeing some early signs of economic stabilization. This is a picture on auto sales. I mean, still not as good as the previous 2 years, but showing a little bit of uptick. I mean, FDI is a well-known, so first 6 months of the year, FDI, foreign direct investment, has increased by about 26-27%. Our GS India current activity indicator has accelerated by about 0.7 percentage points in October. So we are seeing, I think, also if you look at, recent prints on purchasing power in purchasing managers indices or industrial production, I think everything sequentially is showing some uptick. Of course, data is still in the negative territory, but less negative than it was before. So there are both upside and downside risks to our growth forecast. Global growth and oil prices, which are a significant input to the Indian economy, can go either way. Here are some evidence of upside risks or factors that could be more supportive of growth. This is new slippages. This is the banking sector, the bank's assets. And if you look at the bank's assets and the new slippages on bank balance sheets, they seem to have gone down significantly. And on the right, you see corporate balance sheets. Again, corporate balance sheet, this is based on Prowess database for full set of companies, not to leave out particular pockets of stress in sectors such as steel, telecom, power, etc. But for overall set of companies, this is net debt to EBITDA, which has come down, and corporate balance sheets also show some signs of improvement. If you look at NBFCs, the shadow banks, I think liquidity issues compared to a year ago, highly rated NBFCs were accessing markets at 150 to 200 basis points above the repo rate. Now that has come down. On the left chart, if you see the declining spread, that has come down by about, they are still accessing it above the repo, but about 100 basis points rather than 200 basis points above the repo. I think on the right, what you see is, if you look at the face of it, what portion of total system-wide credit is NBFC? And this is just based on publicly available data. I mean, systemically, I think this seems to be small. About 4% of total system-wide credit is actually, more circumspect or has poor asset quality. The number looks small. Of course, you can make the argument that US mortgages also look small as a percent of, total system-wide credit. And probably we are not seeing, much of the problem, which is, I think, a fair argument. However, just to present the facts, if you look at the facts, I think on the face of it, this does not look like a big issue. So what is the big risk to our growth forecast? I think the biggest risk to our growth forecast is still the risk aversion and the lack of confidence in the domestic financial sector. This shows the total lending by the shadow banks or the NBFCs has declined by from 20% to lower single digits. And why has this declined? I think 3 reasons. One, of course, there's an economic slowdown, so less people are asking for loans. Second, I think regulatory restrictions. Central bank has said that there have to be certain regulatory restrictions on the shadow banks, which means that they have less to lend out to the economy. But the third, I think, is the most significant reason, is basically that there's an environment of risk aversion and lack of confidence. So instead of going and lending out to the economy, financial entities are actually shoring up on government securities. And this is perhaps the biggest risk to our growth forecast and the outlook going forward. So a lot of market participants are asking this question, that is India going towards a hard landing? Is growth rate going to go down and down and down? I think these risks may be a bit overplayed, and I say this because of 3 reasons. One is if you look at financial surplus, which is nothing but income minus spending of the private sector, which includes corporates and households. The chart on the left shows that actually it's still fairly high, about 6.5% of GDP, and higher than the long-term average. This has been a common predictor of crisis across the globe. Of course, government has been a guzzler. If you look, the negative, the negative bars on the left panel shows the government deficit. Government has been a guzzler, but the government deficit is not out of line with the long-term average, which you see on the left-hand chart. And if you see on the right-hand chart, it has been more or less stable rather than increasing. Unfortunately, the pointer is not working very well, so on the right-hand chart, the government you can see that line very stable in terms of what's happening to government deficit. So this is a more fundamental reason. I think second, inflation has picked up, but still it's in the 4 to 5% range is what our forecast is. So we do not see serious inflationary imbalances in the economy at this point of time. And third, the external outlook, to the extent that oil remains bounded, to the extent that oil prices remain bounded, which is our baseline forecast, external outlook is also likely to remain benign. So because of these three reasons, I think if you look at private sector financial surpluses, if you look at are there inflationary imbalances, number three, are there external imbalances, all three actually suggest that the risks of a hard landing for the Indian economy, which many market participants are worried about, those risks seem to be a bit overplayed to me. So I will just conclude by saying, without going into details, that look, this is an economy, Indian economy has been rapidly evolving over the last 5 years. Think about the number of changes which have happened. New monetary policy framework, GST, introduction of a new bankruptcy code, many changes to financial regulation and supervision. For example, this regulation of shadow banks has now completely been transferred to the RBI from the National Housing Board, and the privatization, and even the idea to privatize a state oil company is a big thing. So I think the economy is rapidly evolving over the last 5 years, and the implementation of each of these is posing significant challenges for the policymakers, for the private sector, whether you take GST, whether you take IBC, or changes in the financial regulation and supervision landscape. It's basically implementing these things in a country of size and complication like India is posing significant challenges, and that basically is the painful transition. So once the wheels are greased for all these big changes, you will see the tide rise. And basically, that's the essence of my outlook for the next few years. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Prachi. Kind of a nice upbeat pre-Christmas outlook. So thanks for. Most significantly, what I took, of course, I'm not going to repeat what she said, but since the session is on the IBC and the economy, and I have statutory, mandatory comments to make about IBC. One thing that I picked up, you reminded us that actually the slowdown was much before the NBFC crisis, because the NBFC crisis is what could possibly have linkage with how the IBC code can resolve it, although this is about a financial firm and not a non-financial firm. I also heard you say that all the other macro indicators, when you talk to a macroeconomist, if I tell you the inflation is moderate, interest rates are low, foreign exchange reserve is at an all-time high, the stock markets are at an all-time high, what's there to worry about? But I think she made her case comprehensively. So I'd now like to invite Dr. Anuradha Guru for her presentation.
Thank you. Prachi has given us a background of what we can look forward to. So I'll just go back to the IBC thing, and I would like to just present something about the importance of this regime when we brought about these reforms, and what are the green shoots that we are seeing in terms of the outcomes that 3 years down the line we have seen. So as previous analysts have pointed out, the importance of exit mechanisms, I would just like to quote the core committee which looked at the redrafting of the UK insolvency law in 1982, which very nicely puts it as I just quote from here: "It is important to recognize that the world in which we live and the creation of wealth depends on a system founded on credit, and that such a system requires as a corrective an insolvency procedure to cope with its casualties." So this clearly sums up the need for an exit mechanism for any economy. Businesses require investment. When businesses thrive, economy thrives. But ease of getting credit is the basis for businesses to thrive. However, businesses do fail, and for exogenous or endogenous reasons. But non-viable businesses should be allowed to fail, and for the larger economic good, which is actually the sine qua non of efficient, effective, and efficacious economic system. Just to rather put something in perspective, in Silicon Valley, which is the global center for entrepreneurship, the notion of failing is succeeding has ingrained itself. So that entrepreneurs who have actually gone through 1 or 2 bankruptcies are actually looked up with honor. In an article in Newsweek, I happened to just have a look. It says the only way for the industry to breed a handful of unicorns is to fail a whole lot of them. So the economy is in creative destruction, and we need a exit mechanism. Effective insolvency frameworks contribute to reducing the adverse effects of high private debt as economic activity and frees resources from unproductive activities into more productive activities. So it is in the context of the 2016 when the IBC came into force. The background was very unsuccessful earlier experiments to tackle the problem of growing distressed assets, where the NPAs had reached about 12% of gross loans of public sector banks by September 2016. The economic survey of 16-17 reported that 40% of the corporate debt was owned by companies who had interest coverage ratio less than 1, implying an inability to service debt obligations. So what we were staring at was a twin balance sheet crisis, where corporates as well as the banks were reeling under past stress. And that is when the government struck the iron when it was hot and enacted the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So the BLRC, which conceptualized the insolvency framework, observed that we hope that the implementation of this report will increase GDP in India by fostering and emerging a modern credit market, and particularly the corporate bond market. GDP will accelerate when more credit is available to new firms, including firms which lack tangible capital. So while it is too early to assess the impact of the code on these lines, as in the GDP increase, which our earlier speakers have also pointed out, we'll need some time to fructify. There are some green shoots which are clearly evident. There are some direct outcomes and some indirect outcomes on account of the code, which need to be celebrated and recognized. Direct outcomes of the code, such as improvement in realization by creditors, timely resolution of the corporate debtor, and decrease in insolvency resolution process costs, are clearly visible on the ground, which has clearly been also recognized by the Ease of Doing Business report, where we have increased our ranking remarkably to 52 in the insolvency parameter. Resolution time, as you would know, the code specifies very strict timelines of 180 days plus 90 days, though one can always argue that we have missed the timelines in some cases. But of course, as other people have also pointed out, that these are more to do with judicial procedures. To just give some data, by 31st September 2019, 156 corporate insolvency resolution processes had yielded resolution plans, and they had taken an average of 350 days to complete. Around 600 had yielded liquidation, but they took an average of 300 days. However, if we compare with the pre-IBC regime, where we talked about 4.5 years it took for a company to see a resolution or a liquidation, we are really doing very well under the IBC regime. The resolution cost has remarkably come down, which includes fees of IPs, expenses leading to meeting of committee of creditors, public announcements, filings. All of these costs have come down remarkably. It's actually not 9% of the estate value, which was the earlier pre-IBC regime. Recovery rates, as we've always been saying, that IBC is not a recovery mechanism, it's a resolution mechanism. However, even if we have to look at this indicator, we see that we are seeing recovery rates of around 41-42% in the 156 corporate insolvency resolution processes as of now, with a realizable value of 1.4 lakh crore against the immediate value of 3.3 lakh crores. However, against the liquidation value of these firms, we are seeing a recovery of as much as 189%. So, in all of these, direct outcomes are quite visible. If we look at some indirect outcomes, we are seeing that the availability of credit is expanding. Gross bank credit has grown at the rate of 12.2% in 18-19 as compared to 8.2% in 17-18, and most of this increase has been in non-food credit. There is substantial increase in credit to MSME sector also. The gross NPAs the growth of gross NPAs to gross advances has been coming down. It was as high as 9.9% in 16-17, increasing to 11%, but now we are seeing the NPAs to gross advances coming down to 9.3%. So all of these are indirect effects on account of the code, though direct linkages would be difficult to assess as of now. And most importantly, behavioral changes that other panelists have also pointed out is bringing about a vast change in the manner in which creditors and debtors relate to each other. The credible threat to a resolution process that may shift the control and management of the firm from the existing promoters is acting as a deterrent for the management and promoters of the firm from operating below the optimum level. So it's also motivating them to use the best efforts to avoid default, and it is encouraging them to take all measures to avoid defaults. Some of the figures that can be related on this is around 186 corporate insolvency processes filed in the code have been settled on appeal review before admission. 116 of them have withdrawn under Section 12A after some kind of settlement being reached. So all of this goes on to show that all efforts are being made by promoters to hold on to their companies and not let it pass away. So in conclusion, I would just like to say that the code is achieving its objective effectively, efficiently, and efficaciously, and it's making all its effort to see that the economy, the GDP grows as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anuradha. Actually, that is a very good compliment to the previous presentation, and the data that you gave is indicative. As I said earlier also, that these are, you can correlate, but of course no single law can take credit. The fact that NPAs are coming down, there's no doubt about it. Perhaps that also contributed to the upbeat version that we saw from the macro outlook. But definitely the NPAs are coming down. And there are, as Dr. Anuradha said, there are perhaps unseen behavioral changes because of credible threat, or I don't know whether the word to use is threat or deterrence for credit discipline. And the interesting statistics was on the insolvencies which got resolved even before admission to the court, and that number is also increasing. So I think these are all, and of course the number which is also quoted by Dr. Sahu about the ratio of the value realized vis-a-vis the liquidation value. So when that starts going up, so all these are indicators, and I think they definitely point towards not just a better credit culture and more availability of credit, but economic implications as well. So I'd like to now invite Dr. Shubhashis.
Thank you, Ajit. Vivek in the morning in the first session talked about we not being familiar with exit, and quite rightly said, I do remember that in the 1991 when we started the reform process, one of the things that the finance ministry did do was set up a committee and called it the Exit Policy Committee. And I know that since I was a member there, and one of my co-members used to go around saying that in India we have a lot of sick companies but no sick promoters. And that before the IBC that was quite true. I hope that with the IBC that becomes a lot less true. Now in the morning session, both given the title of the conference or the seminar, and given the two speakers we had, Dr. Sahu and Vivek, essentially both the markets and the economy were covered and their relationship to the IBC. One of the things I would like to stress on what Dr. Sahu said is that not only are new markets developing, the important thing about these new markets is that these are actually making the economy more sophisticated. And with this sophistication comes specialization, and that actually increases the productivity of the economy, which we may not be able to see right away. So in that sense, I'd like to add that thing to what Dr. Sahu said. And also to what Dr. Debroy said regarding the economy, he is right that it will take some time for these things to work out. We are in an adjustment process. We are going through a process of transition. And during that time, if we try to reap the benefits of a steady state economy, we would be, what I'm worried about essentially is that the process will stop. If we start looking for benefits and don't find them immediately and try to therefore tweak, we may actually destroy the process. So in that sense, I think that what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the significance of the IBC in the economy without reporting any data, because much of it has already been given. So I want to start with something that was referred to by Professor Van Swieten. So regarding the UK administratorship, and also she mentioned in passing the US Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Right? And indeed we don't have that at the moment quite a lot. But I would like to say that what the IBC is doing is that the IBC, from what I have seen, really tries to reorganize the firm and keep it going, right? So its first easy step of liquidation is not the goal, and that in and of itself is quite remarkable. The reasons that Professor Van Swieten gave regarding why it may not be a good idea in India to have that is absolutely right. We do not as yet have those sets of professionals which we need for this process to work the way it works in the UK, or it works even in the US Chapter 11. Please remember that the judges there are extremely well versed in economics. I was on the board of a university with a Columbia University law professor, and he told me something that blew my mind. This is about 2 years ago. He told me something that blew my mind, in the sense that every single professor or every single faculty member in the law department in Columbia University at that time had their first degrees in economics. And indeed, if you look at the bankruptcy judges in the US, they are highly trained in economics, right? So that is important. We don't have that as yet. And yet, much of the disagreements that happen in the process of implementation of IBC ends up in court. So the question to ask is, if we do not have expert judges, why do we still go through courts, and should we get rid of it? I'm mentioning this point because there are a lot of people who are saying, get more rule-based when it comes to bankruptcy, have the absolute priority rule, do all those things that don't change or do not. Why do you need this sort of bankruptcy procedures? Now, one reason we need that is because, as an economist, you do know that when we contract for something into the future, as time goes by, regardless of bankruptcy or no bankruptcy, we have more information. And given more information, we may want to renegotiate what we had committed to at an earlier stage when we didn't have all this new information, right? So we should look at the bankruptcy process, not the bankruptcy code, but the bankruptcy process as a process where renegotiation takes place, and that reduces transaction costs. This is an established institution, which if it works efficiently, is the best way to renegotiate, right? So that is one way we can look at it. The reason why we bring in the courts is because of the lack of professionalism. That's because markets are still developing. Whatever happens in courts is in the public domain, and that is an advantage. We do have very little trust in businesses in India, right? So what goes on behind closed doors in terms of professional activities are not treated with a great amount of trust, and hence when we know that there is a lack of professional expertise in going through the whole bankruptcy process, it is better to have it through the courts, because at least it's in the public domain, right? And people can therefore monitor, or there could be public debates on various things that are undertaken. So in that sense also, I think the way we are proceeding with the IBC is probably, given the Indian context, the best way. And one clinching evidence of that I would like to give, or illustration of what I'm trying to say I'd like to give, is what happened with the latest cooperative bank failure. It is astonishing that no one caught on. We have a fantastic digitized management information system in banking, and yet nobody caught on to the fact that so much of exposure of this small bank was to one asset, right? So that's the reason why it's good to be in the public domain, when we don't have either the requisite professionalism, well, that covers both trust as well as corruption. So the requisite professionalism, that's politically the correct word to say. The other thing that Vivek referred to was the costs of adjustment, and I would like to connect that to what again Professor Van Swyten said regarding COC having too much of power, the Committee of Creditors having too much power. I think, again, as an economist, I will look at the context and at the consistency of what we are trying to do over here. Now, this whole concept, and I'm going to look at public corporations because that's easier to explain. Now, in a public corporation, both the equity owners and the creditors are investors. And being investors, you know, everything, all the things that go for the equity owners should go for the creditors too. But for matters of efficiency, we separate ownership and management. And one of the things we do is we break up investors into two parts, those who are equity owners and those who are creditors. And as creditors, they give away, they give up their right to control the daily operations of the firm in return for seniority of payment. And you know, in finance, we look at it as an option, which essentially means that if the equity owners are unable to pay their or honor their debt obligations or debt repayments, then control passes over to the creditors, and creditors become owners of the asset. It is based on this principle that everything that we talk about after that, both in the UK as well as in the US, right, that we look at the entire bankruptcy setup, it follows from this basic principle, right? So whenever we are doing anything, we better make sure, right, that this is what is being followed. And then we can talk about consistency. And in that context, I think our committee of creditors, again, given the context in India, it's better that they have in any case, that was the reason why they were given that control, because there has been a failure and because they'd given up their right to control before. So that's the contracted upon agreement, right? So you have to follow that. Otherwise, what Vivek said regarding contract law enforcement, which is very poor in India, we don't want that to get affected again. So in that sense, I do not think that the Committee of Creditors as they stand now have too much power. The only problem I have with it is, again, since we are looking for consistency, consistent with what I said, our banks are supposed to operate like any bank. Unfortunately, most of our banks and most of our banking assets and most of the problems we have had with NPAs and all of that are in public sector banks. And public sector banks do not necessarily operate fully as banks are supposed to operate, right? So that's one area of concern. The other area of concern I'll come to if I have time. How much time do I have? The next thing I want to talk about is deadweight loss. I say this because I was at a conference on Thursday where there was a professor from the Chicago Law School talking about this thing which economists have been talking about a lot, because economists' interest in bankruptcy institutions is precisely because of what I said, the renegotiation clause, and the fact that bankruptcy is considered by economists always as a deadweight loss, should it result in a liquidation of the company. Right? So all the teamwork, customer relationships, supply chain relationships, all those which take time and effort to build up are now lost. Okay? So in that sense, it's a deadweight loss. And hence he was harping on the significance of renegotiation. And in that context, again, I like the way the IBC functions, because that's its first objective, to keep it as a going concern. Bring in fresh equity, reorganize, give the early promoters maybe some leeway, but it's not a given, which it was the case under BIFR and SICA, right? So all of that, I do like, it may not be perfect, but it's definitely in the right direction. And in this context, it's probably best to look at the impact of IBC on the economy in two separate ways. One is the post-bankruptcy impact, right? So once a company goes into a state of bankruptcy, what do we see compared to what we saw under BIFR and SICA, right? And those are the data that have been handed out by both Dr. Sahu and just a little while ago by Anuradha. So those are all, very important things. But there is another thing with Ajit in his opening conversation, and I've heard him say that before also, right? Talk about what we don't see, or the pre-bankruptcy activities, or the pre-bankruptcy contracting, pre-bankruptcy relationships because of what has been done in bankruptcy. Ajit didn't want to use the term credible threat, but I think that's a good term to use, because let's call a spade a spade. Those threats are necessary to bring in the discipline that we want in investment in India. So what we don't see, and this I'll just refer to a work that I had done long ago in the early 90s, right, when we had analyzed the SICA and BIFR laws. This was when we were doing the exit policy in the 91 post-reforms period. Was that what we found, quite surprisingly, was that if you followed the dividend distribution policy of companies, you could predict, right, well before they became sick, that they were going to be sick. In other words, they were using the SICA and BIFR to what we often call asset stripping, right? So they were stripping off assets, stripping off all liquidity that was there in the firm or in the company, because managers do have prior information, something that is referred to as expropriation of value, right? So do have prior information regarding where the company was headed or what the market conditions are. And given the threat of the banks moving in, they quickly stripped it of assets, right? So this sort of opportunistic behavior has definitely been blocked by the IBC if it is allowed to function. And in that context, the last thing that I said, that I'm going to refer to it later, is this distinction that we have made between financial creditors and operational creditors. It's quite unique, right? But I think it is quite contextual given India, because much of these operational creditors are actually related parties, right? And it's not difficult to create examples of where, given the prior information of managers, for them to enter into arrangements, right, of over-invoicing to ensure that more of the asset which could not be stripped before bankruptcy can now be stripped after bankruptcy. So given the Indian context, I'm fully in support of the distinction that has been made, not only in the definition, but also in the powers in the COC between the operational creditors and the financial creditors. Thank you.
Thank you, Shubhashis. It's very refreshing to see such pro-establishment views from a normal contrarian and a rebel. So he said everything nice about the code, everything was nice. So thank you. But I just want to reiterate one point that he said, that actually from an economist point of view, the IBC, the code, the bankruptcy process is actually a renegotiation process, and everything, and I made a very strong point that everything that can avoid a liquidation, something that was reflected in Dr. Sahu's opening remarks, should be done. So, and that is reflected in the code itself, in the functioning of the regulator as well as the processes, that if we have to go to liquidation, that's kind of a last resort. And the numbers are looking very optimistic. Actually, I'm just looking at the time, since I'm the timekeeper, we have a time shortage. So I will encourage, if there are questions from the audience, we can start right away. Otherwise, I will ask one or two questions. We can have a discussion on the panel. So while we wait, do we have a sort of a roaming mic for the audience? Yes. So please feel free. Please keep your questions very brief so that we can have brief answers also. But while we wait for the first question, I want to ask Dr. Prachi about, we had a report, and now it's a Harvard University working paper from the former chief economic advisor, who talked about not twin, but now quadruple balance sheet, stretch balance sheet problems, and balance sheets ultimately are related to bankruptcies. So this twin balance sheet problem was about corporates being over leveraged and infrastructure and banks, especially because of lending to infrastructure, being overstretched, reflecting NPAs. And that while that happened, then subsequently we also have two more balance sheet problems in NBFCs and real estate companies. So now I believe India has now to tackle four stretched balance sheets. So do you feel that this is any sort of a caveat or risk for the economic revival?
Thank you, Ajit. I have to admit that I just read some news articles about India being in an ICU, and I was like, the information I think on the four balance sheet problem, in my view, I think again I've not looked at in details at the paper or anything, but it's a bit dated. If you look at bank balance sheet, SBI chairman is here. If you look at slippage, new accretion of new slippages, I showed that chart in my presentation, has gone down dramatically. Number one, if you look at corporate balance sheets, again, I don't rule out stresses in particular pockets like telecom, we know now, steel or power. But if you look at, I showed the data from Prowess for full set of companies which we have available for FY19. Corporate balance sheets are looking healthier than they were few years ago. These two are data points. So I think I think his information in terms of four balance sheet problems overall, if you look at the aggregate numbers, is a bit dated. The 3 and 4, I think, yeah, I mean, it's been a year, ILF has defaulted. But again, I showed you that, at the margin, liquidity issues, if anything, are getting better, right? I mean, it's a year ago, highly rated NBFCs were accessing funds at 200 basis points above the repo. They are now accessing funds at like 120 basis points above the repo. Bank funding to NBFCs is fairly robust. So even on the third one, I think the information seems to be a bit dated. Yeah. Things are actually improving at the margin. And this was one of my questions, when Moody's actually downgraded the India outlook. My question, I had a discussion with Moody's and I asked them, and they said, NBFC issue is one of the reasons. And basically I said that, if you had downgraded the outlook a year ago, I would have actually understood. Now, when actually things are improving, you're downgrading the outlook. So I think that's
fair point. I think fair point is your presentation was much more forward-looking, and maybe the paper is based on past data. Any questions? So I have a question for Dr. Shubhashis. See, this process which started with SARFAESI and now we have IBC is seen as the pendulum swinging more towards creditor rights. Between creditors and debtors, and bankruptcy is all about the relationship between. While in the West, I believe the pendulum had swung too far towards the creditors. So do you feel that we may actually come to a stage, while India was talking about these reforms, the West was talking about bankruptcy reform, where they wanted the firms to have more space, breathing space, so that the creditors and the quote-unquote vultures don't destroy it. So it seems like, I am always fascinated that while the Western world grapples with one end of the pendulum, India is now at the other end of the pendulum, where we had to strengthen creditor rights. Do you see this kind of a dichotomy?
Well, the first thing that we need to learn from that is that each economy does what is best for itself, and therefore we should stop trying to copy other economies. I think that's the first lesson we learn, because economic policy is extremely contextual. Yes, there is a theoretical basis, there is a generic way of looking at things, but when it comes to the nitty-gritty details of law, especially commercial law, things that affect everyday behavior, we have to be contextual. So in that sense, that's the first lesson we draw. The second lesson is that, well, what you said, if I look at countries anecdotally, what you're saying may probably be true, because almost the countries did move towards more what you call debtor in possession sort of situation.
Filings increased dramatically in Chapter 11, Chapter 7.
Yeah, so there was sort of a leaning towards debtor in possession bankruptcy procedures. But please understand, as I said, this is because in those societies, right, there was professional expertise to handle it that way, because we all know what the issues are in terms of, given asymmetric information and opportunistic behavior, what could happen under debtor in possession. Could you block that with expertise, right? So that's the issue, and countries that could block that did. However, if we take a more objective parametric definition of what is creditor friendly and what is debtor friendly, then again we had a paper with a colleague of mine and I, where we showed that in creditor friendly countries, both the debt equity ratios, the things like the parameters that Dr. Sahu was talking about, like time to settlement, recovery rates, were all higher in more creditor friendly countries than in debtor friendly countries. And hence, you know.
Okay. You have a question? Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
One particular question, I think you mentioned about ICU and all this stuff. And I'm a boring lawyer, understand a little bit of, I'm just becoming complete. I said I'm a boring lawyer, understand the code better, less of economy. But I think one of the places where I heard about the fiscal stimulus and the deficit number, and what was told was that if you add the state deficit to the central deficit, it's hugely out of number. Is it true, or it's again a hyperstatement?
Yeah, by the way, the ICU thing, I was just saying because I haven't read the paper. Ajit referred to that, and I said I just read in a newspaper article that India is in an ICU, and I'm asking myself, what is this? So on fiscal deficit, clearly, I think if you combine center, states, and public sector enterprises, it's between, our estimate is 8.2% of GDP. The question is, at this stage of the economy, is this really a big risk, and what ranking? In my view, I didn't have a chance to go into those details. I think biggest risks are still the lack of confidence and risk aversion in the domestic financial sector. Number two, global risks. I think if oil changes right now, I think it will have significant spillovers for India, though that's not our baseline. And fiscal, I think at this point, probably at this stage of the economy, I think we perceive it as less of a risk, though of course if you look at the overall deficit, it remains high if you compare it with other emerging economies. Ajit asked me to keep it brief so we can have a bilateral discussion.
Time constraint. Any question? Yeah, please.
Good afternoon, August House. My question is for Dr. Shubhashis. So you said it's fair to differentiate between operational creditors and financial creditors. Won't you think after this all the other corporates will find it difficult to get operational credit because operational creditors are treated at a lower step?
This is a good question. Thank you for asking. I should have covered it. Whether there is, we talk about moral hazard and all of that in economics. So whether there is moral hazard, no moral hazard, whether there is asymmetric information or no asymmetric information, if you allow contracting, then the priorities don't matter. If I look at the COC and the way it operates, its impact really is algebraically equivalent to the impact that you would see if the financial creditors had greater priority over or higher priority over operational creditors. Right? This sort of priority does not matter under contracting. It's all, and that's why the thing that Vivek referred to in terms of cost of doing business is not a very good parameter, because if the way you are measuring the cost of doing business is not all encompassing, right? Then two systems which are perfectly equivalent could give you different costs of doing business simply because the prioritization of various claimants are flipped around, right? Though they're equivalent in terms of surplus generated efficiency and all of that economists look at. So in that sense, no, it is not unfair, because as long as operational creditors know they're going to include it in the pricing, right? And as long as we don't take the cost of doing business too seriously, there will be no criticism of that, and we would be happily going along.
Okay.
Hi.
One last question. Yeah. Sorry.
My question is
Two last questions. You and the one gentleman behind you.
Yes. My question is regarding this recently introduced Second Amendment Bill 2019 in the code. It's about, now they have said it's, as a home buyer, you need to find 100 more or to file an application. So if Dr. Sahu or any panelist can throw out what is the logic behind this, because as a home buyer, I need to find for 100 people to file
Yeah, I
application.
don't know whether it's relevant to this, but Dr. Sahu, would you like to respond? There is a session on this, so they will increase the threshold to trigger the bankruptcy in home buyers. Yeah, so that's last. Yeah, last question, please. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. My question to Dr. Ranade and Prachi Mishra. So, considering that most of the economists were surprised by the fall in GDP growth to 4.5% for July-September, and even in the past, many forecasts have gone wrong. So, are not we seeing these green shoots too early, considering the fact that our food inflation has gone to again to double digits, and there are now risks whether the RBI will again start tightening the rates as well. Thank you.
So your question on, I did say, there are signs of economic stabilization. I pointed out to, some auto sales data, FDI, if you look, first 6 months of the year is up by 25%. Our current activity index, which is, combination of 15 indicators, is showing slight, 0.5 percentage points uptick. I completely agree with you that these are still very early signs. We have to track the data very closely, but we do track the data very closely, and we are looking for these early signs. So, but I completely take your point that these are still early days, but we also have, based on the data we have to take a view on how we see the economy going forward.
Very briefly, the inflation currently is confined to food inflation. In fact, in the fiscal year which ended in March 2019. The food inflation for that year was the lowest since 1991. It was a remarkable year. So what we are seeing now is food inflation, which is notoriously volatile, and therefore it's too early to say whether the RBI will actually resort to interest rate tightening based on this data. And as always, this is something we need to monitor all the time. So I'm going to close the session with one final question to Dr. Shubhashis, because he made a point about, he believes that more transparency is good, and I mean, of course, that's a very generic statement, but in the context of public companies, you said, and it's the reason we need the court process is because everything is out in the domain, so you don't want this renegotiation process to happen in the bedroom, in the dark. So can you throw more light on this? Because what happens is, if everything is going to be in the public domain, the people may not actually explore all possible ways of renegotiation, including stuff which they think is risky to be in the public domain. So, your comments.
Yeah, this is putting an economist on the spot, because we have a lot of models of transparency in committee hearings and non-transparency in committee hearings, and they have different impacts given the type of problem you're trying to study. Now, the thing that I specifically referred to was the fact that when these cases are brought to court, there is a certain degree of criticism that is gathering ground, whereby people are saying that why should everything go to court? The IBC should lay down the rules, right? And the courts should only see that those rules are followed. That if there is any deviation from the rules, yes, of course, it can go to court, but then it becomes essentially a law and order problem, right? You're not following rules that you're supposed to follow. So that is what people are pushing towards. All that I'm saying is that given that this is a renegotiation process, that's a wrong approach. That's all I'm saying. We do not want things to end up in court, of course, because it's a deadweight loss too, waste of time. Lawyers have to spend a lot of time, right? I'm sorry for that. But but that's what it is, because this dispute that is being settled in court does not affect positively in any way the surplus that is there to have. Instead, it subtracts from it. But we are okay with that subtraction, because in the rest of the situations, the value is going to be maximized, right? So that's the approach. So therefore, that's the transparency I'm talking about.
The positive impact of the unseen stuff, the behavioral changes in society at large. Yeah. Sorry, you want to do something?
just one quick response to Mr. Saraf's question. I hope I've convinced you with my presentation that my view is exactly the opposite, that we are nowhere near the ICO. I mean, that was the whole point of the presentation.
I think we triggered something.
I just wanted to say lawyers are trained to actually see a light at the end of the tunnel, even in legal system. So I'm very positive about your presentation.
So as the session is wrapping up, it's creating more friction and excitement. So I'm happy to see that. And we obviously triggered something in Prachi because she's very allergic to this ICU reference. Anyway, it's my pleasant duty to wrap up. I just want to mention one thing before we wrap up that came in again in the morning, Dr. Sahu's comment as well as Dr. Shubhashis, that one positive impact on the economy, which may be small, is the huge number of economic activity and markets which are started. Market for professionals, information utilities, and now even education diplomas and who knows, university degree programs. So that's certainly all new. So so I would like to thank all the panelists here and thank you for your participation. Thank you.